Freeze the scene at the instant Judas approaches Jesus. Why would a public teacher require an identifying kiss at all? Jesus had taught openly in Jerusalem, where listeners, opponents, and temple authorities could see and hear him in daylight. This documentary asks what the kiss actually solved, and where the surviving evidence requires us to stop. Mark gives the first firm clue before Scene 8. Judas had arranged a sign before the arrest. Matthew says the same basic thing. The kissed man was the one the crowd should seize immediately. Luke narrates Judas coming near to kiss Jesus, then centers Jesus' direct confrontation with his betrayer. John never narrates the kiss. Instead, Jesus steps forward and identifies himself to those seeking him. So the first useful answer is textual. In Mark and Matthew, the kiss is a prearranged identification signal. The accounts also place weapons, tension, disciples, and an arresting crowd inside the same confined and unstable moment. The movement begins in Jerusalem and ends across the Kidron at a meeting place Judas already knew well. John alone names lanterns and torches, equipment that makes nighttime action possible but does not make recognition effortless. The four accounts overlap, but they do not provide one camera-perfect sequence. Their differences must remain visible. Mark 14:44 says the betrayer had given them a sign. The wording makes prior planning explicit rather than accidental, and the command that follows connects recognition directly to seizure. That sequence anchors every later explanation. In Mark, Judas goes straight to Jesus, addresses him as rabbi, and performs the kiss. Only then do the waiting men lay hands on Jesus and take control of him. The order is simple and consequential. Mark adds an operational detail: seize him and lead him away securely. The signal therefore belongs to an arrest plan, not merely to a symbolic scene remembered afterward. Its practical purpose is already visible. The plan immediately enters danger. One bystander draws a sword and strikes the high priest's servant, showing how quickly a controlled detention could become a confused fight. The danger was immediate, not theoretical. Jesus answers by contrasting this armed seizure with his daily public teaching in the temple. The contrast condemns the manner and timing of the arrest, without explaining every practical choice. The public setting sharpens that nighttime contrast. Matthew 26:48 also calls the gesture a sign and attaches the same instruction: identify the kissed man, then seize him. Here again, the purpose is stated before the action occurs. Matthew leaves little doubt about function. Matthew includes Judas's greeting before the kiss. The approach is socially legible before it becomes legally decisive, allowing the informer to close the final distance without pointing from afar. Proximity is part of the signal. Mark and Matthew therefore answer part of our question directly. The kiss tells the arresting party which man to take. Any historical reconstruction must begin with that explicit narrative function. The text itself supplies that answer. Luke 22:47 does not pause to explain a prior arrangement. Judas leads the crowd and approaches to kiss Jesus, while the narration moves immediately toward Jesus' response. Luke preserves the approach, not the briefing. Luke shifts attention to Jesus' words. The betrayal is exposed at the moment the familiar gesture is attempted. The account emphasizes moral confrontation more than the mechanics of the signal. That emphasis is distinctly Lucan. Luke identifies the injured ear as the right one and presents Jesus stopping the violence and healing the servant. John later names Peter and Malchus, details Luke does not supply here. Luke names chief priests, temple officers, and elders among those Jesus addresses. The authority structure is visibly layered, but the passage does not provide a precise roster or command chart. Exact staffing remains beyond recovery. John 18 begins after Jesus crosses the Kidron with his disciples and enters a garden or enclosed, cultivated place. John gives movement and destination, not a surviving map of the property. The cultivated setting remains broadly described. John explains why Judas can lead anyone there. Jesus had often met there with his disciples. The betrayer's useful knowledge, therefore, concerns both the person and the familiar meeting place. Place knowledge precedes the arrest. John lists lanterns, torches, and weapons, then says Jesus steps forward and asks whom they seek. The equipment establishes a prepared nighttime operation, but not perfect visibility. Prepared light still has limits. The answer is Jesus the Nazarene. John's emphasis is not secret recognition, but Jesus' deliberate self-identification, repeated after the arresting group reacts and the question is asked again. Recognition becomes a spoken exchange. A careful reconstruction starts with geography. The Kidron Valley separates Jerusalem's eastern side from the Mount of Olives, so the movement carries the group away from the city's central precincts. That geography frames the night movement. John gives the crossing, but none of the Gospels preserves the exact path, gate, or garden boundary used that night. Modern maps can illustrate possibilities, not recover the lost route. The distinction protects evidence from illustration. Gethsemane is associated with the Mount of Olives, yet the surviving texts do not supply a recoverable garden plan. Any precise wall, gate, press, or tree arrangement would be modern invention. Precision would exceed the source. A plausible reconstruction is movement from a lit urban zone into darker agricultural ground broken by trees, walls, paths, and slopes. That setting could complicate sightlines without making recognition impossible. Terrain alone cannot prove confusion. Artificial light helps, but a torch does not flatten distance. It creates glare nearby, throws moving shadows across faces, and leaves people beyond its brightest circle harder to inspect. Visibility would change from step to step. A covered lamp or lantern can guide feet and hands without giving every observer a clear, steady face. John's two lighting terms imply preparation, not modern floodlighting. The objects support only cautious inference. The disciples likely wore ordinary garments suitable to the setting. That does not make them identical. It only means clothing alone may have been a weak and hurried identifier. No resemblance theory is required. Judas contributes two things the texts clearly support: knowledge of the meeting place, and, in Mark and Matthew, a signal. Together they turn location into a targeted arrest. The signal completes the guide's task. What problem does a signal solve? First, it turns general knowledge into positive identification at the decisive second, when hesitation could separate the intended prisoner from the surrounding disciples. That is the operational value. Some participants may have recognized Jesus. The text never says nobody did. A sign still removes hesitation for everyone who must act together, including those less familiar with his face. Shared certainty matters more than universal ignorance. Second, the signal places the informer beside the target, where direction becomes unmistakable even without shouted instructions. The body of Judas becomes a moving pointer inside the group. The cue becomes physically precise. Third, it coordinates action. The arresting hands move on one person before companions can scatter, resist, block the path, or create uncertainty about whom the authorities actually want. Coordination reduces the space for error. The sword episode proves that the moment could become violent quickly. Speed and certainty would matter to any arrest detail trying to seize one man while avoiding a larger clash. The narrative itself displays that risk. Mark's instruction to lead Jesus away securely suggests concern not merely with seeing him, but controlling the removal. Identification is only the first step in a planned custody sequence. Custody requires more than recognition. Different members of the group may have had different knowledge. Leaders could know the accusation and the destination, while frontline attendants still needed a simple cue for the correct man. Knowledge was probably unevenly distributed. That is a strong inference, not a recorded briefing. The texts give the signal and the resulting seizure. They do not preserve the planner's full discussion or every participant's familiarity. Our reconstruction must remain modest. Why choose a kiss? Because it is close, visible, and socially recognizable as a greeting rather than a distant accusation. It lets Judas approach the target without a shouted command. The choice is both ordinary and exact. Mark and Matthew use the ordinary verb phileo in the planned statement. The one Judas will kiss is the target. The verb names the act plainly before the signal is performed. The planned wording remains straightforward. When Judas performs the action, both accounts use kataphileo. Lexicons can suggest an emphatic, repeated, or affectionate kiss, but the exact force of a compound verb depends on context. No single gloss settles the scene. The change in verb may sharpen the enacted gesture, yet it cannot reveal Judas's inner emotion or a hidden code. Greek vocabulary is evidence, not a psychological detector. That boundary prevents lexical overreach. Paul's letters tell believers to greet one another with a holy kiss in Romans, both Corinthian letters, and 1 Thessalonians. Those instructions show that kissing could function as recognized communal greeting. The gesture was socially intelligible. Luke 7:45 also treats a kiss as a recognizable act of welcome. These texts establish social use, but they do not prove that every greeting followed one universal rule. Practice varied by relationship and setting. That social legibility makes the betrayal narratively sharp. A gesture associated with welcome, loyalty, or relationship becomes the mechanism of seizure, and the audience understands the reversal immediately. The irony needs no hidden meaning. Practically, the kiss identifies at touching distance. Narratively, it exposes betrayal through an action associated with relationship. The same gesture can solve an arrest problem and carry moral weight. Both functions operate at once. The arresting party is harder to reconstruct than many paintings suggest. Each gospel selects different labels, authorities, and objects, so a responsible diagram must preserve uncertainty rather than erase it. The vocabulary resists a single tableau. Mark describes a crowd with swords and clubs coming from the chief priests, scribes, and elders. The term crowd identifies a group, not its training, exact number, or internal ranks. Its social composition remains unspecified. Matthew calls it a large crowd from the chief priests and elders. Large is descriptive, not a recoverable head count, and the text does not convert the gathering into a numbered unit. The adjective cannot supply arithmetic. Luke refers to chief priests, temple officers, and elders. The Greek title strategoi can denote commanders connected with temple security, but it does not specify every subordinate present. Translation choices should preserve that caution. John uses spera for a detachment and hyperatai for officers or attendants from the chief priests and Pharisees. The vocabulary suggests more than one source of authority. That combination deserves careful handling. Spera often carries a Roman military sense, so some Roman participation is historically plausible. Yet interpreters debate the exact force here, and the narrative gives no complete chain of command. Possibility is not the same as certainty. It is unsafe to convert the term into a full cohort count. Even if a Roman sense is chosen, the word alone does not state how many people arrived. A label is not a census. Across the accounts, we can responsibly picture armed personnel with illumination and official backing. We cannot responsibly claim a standardized formation, a precise troop total, or an undisputed Roman command. The scene remains historically bounded. Jesus himself says he taught openly in the temple. Public visibility is therefore a fact inside the arrest narratives, not a later attempt to make the recognition question harder. That fact creates the central puzzle. But public visibility is not the same as personal recognition by every person assigned to a nighttime arrest. Reputation can travel much farther than a reliably remembered face. Operational familiarity may still vary. A teacher can be publicly known while many observers know his name, controversy, or voice better than his appearance. Crowds, columns, distance, and movement limit close observation. Public space does not guarantee intimacy. The sources do not tell us which guards had seen Jesus closely, how often they had done so, or whether the frontline arresting attendants were among those earlier observers. The missing information matters. Nor do the accounts say Jesus was disguised. Darkness and unfamiliarity are plausible factors, but they cannot be promoted into evidence for concealment that the narratives never mention. The distinction blocks a popular overclaim. The disciples need not look alike for a signal to help. Similar practical clothing, close grouping, and uneven light can slow a decision without making adult faces indistinguishable. Ordinary conditions are enough. Positive identification protects the operation from seizing the wrong man, especially when the guide already knows him personally. The kiss transfers Judas's certainty to the people who must act. That transfer is the signal's strength. The most responsible answer allows mixed recognition. Some may know Jesus, others may not, and the sign settles the matter for the entire group at one coordinated moment. No universal ignorance is necessary. Now place the accounts side by side without forcing them into one script. Their shared event carries distinct narrative emphasis, and those emphases shape how each gospel answers the question. Narrative comparison clarifies rather than flattens. Mark and Matthew foreground the arranged signal. Judas identifies, the crowd seizes, resistance follows, and Jesus challenges the manner of arrest. Their sequence keeps the kiss operationally central. The kiss drives their arrest logic. Luke keeps the approach but centers Jesus naming the betrayal, then stopping violence and healing the wounded servant. The attempted greeting becomes the setting for confrontation and mercy. Luke's purpose lies elsewhere. If careful Bible history like this is useful, subscribe to World Behind the Verse. Now return immediately to John, whose account makes a different feature central. The comparison resumes without delay. John omits the kiss scene and gives Jesus the initiative. He steps forward, asks whom the party seeks, and identifies himself rather than waiting to be singled out. John's Jesus is not passive. John repeats the exchange and links Jesus' self-identification with his concern that the disciples be allowed to leave. The narrative focus falls on control, disclosure, and protection. That emphasis differs from the synoptics. Judas remains present in John, standing with the arresting group, but the identifying gesture is not narrated. That silence should be observed, not filled with invented choreography. Absence here is a narrative fact. We do not need to call one account an error or silently insert every detail into every gospel. Comparison can preserve both overlap and each writer's chosen emphasis. Discipline avoids artificial harmonization. Several popular explanations go beyond the sources. None of the four Gospels says Jesus disguised himself, changed his appearance, or used darkness to hide from the arresting party. The disguise theory lacks textual support. They also do not say Jesus and the disciples had mysteriously identical faces, or were impossible to distinguish. That claim solves the puzzle by inventing a new one. The resemblance theory does too. The Greek vocabulary does not hide a private psychological message. It describes kissing. The betrayal comes from the stated signal, Judas's role, and the action that immediately follows. Context supplies the treachery. Nor does the kiss require a conspiracy about secret passwords or esoteric ritual. Mark and Matthew already tell us its stated function in direct, practical language. The explanation is already public. Darkness, torch glare, unfamiliar personnel, crowd confusion, and urgency are historically plausible contributors. Yet no single factor is named as the sole reason the planners chose a kiss. Plausibility must remain labeled as plausibility. The contrast between open teaching and secretive arrest explains the irony and Jesus' challenge. It does not necessarily explain every practical decision made by those organizing the seizure. Irony and logistics are different questions. We can know Judas supplied access to the place and led the arriving group. We cannot know every conversation, fear, contingency, or personal motive behind the chosen signal. Silence should remain silence. A sound conclusion should therefore separate 4 levels: what the text says, strong inference, plausible reconstruction, and what remains unknown. Mixing those levels creates false certainty. Those categories keep wonder honest. The text says, Mark and Matthew present a prearranged kiss as the identifying sign for the man to be seized. That is the firmest answer available. Everything else must build from it. John adds that Judas knew the meeting place, while all 4 accounts place him with the arriving group. His role joins access, guidance, betrayal, and arrest. The accounts agree on his participation. A strong inference is that the signal gave immediate positive identification during a tense operation with companions close by, weapons present, and the possibility of resistance. That inference fits the narrated danger. A plausible reconstruction is that a familiar greeting let Judas approach naturally, confirm the target at close range, and trigger coordinated action without distant pointing. It remains reconstruction, not recovered transcript. We cannot recover the exact mix of darkness, unfamiliarity, command structure, fear of resistance, prior recognition, or concern about seizing the wrong disciple. The sources do not rank those factors. So why did Judas need a kiss? In Mark and Matthew, because the arrest plan called for a specific, immediate, socially natural identification signal. The practical answer is therefore layered. The kiss did not prove Jesus was unknowable or disguised. It made the intended target unmistakable at the moment the arresting hands moved toward one man. Identification became immediate and actionable. Which gospel detail most shapes how you understand the arrest? The planned signal, Luke's confrontation, or Jesus stepping forward in John? Subscribe for more evidence-led Bible history. Your answer can begin the next investigation.